Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. In this presidential election, there's a lot of concern about threats to democracy, but we've been here before. A new book by Brown University professor Corey Brettschneider, titled The Presidents and the People, profiles 5 presidents who expanded their power and tried to overturn democratic principles. He argues that the hope for our future lies not with the courts or politicians, but with we, the people. He's here to tell us more. Professor Brettschneider, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
So what was the inspiration for this book?
Well, this is a book written in the midst of the Trump presidency and the aftermath of January 6th. I had written a piece for Politico called Trump versus the Constitution, and a book called The Oath and the Office, and the subtitle of that book was A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. But what Trump really started to show me is that as much as I believe in the principles I defended of the Constitution and believe that that is a guide to what a good president would do, I wanted to write a book that followed up on that by talking about the dangers of a bad president or a criminal president. And so this really is a more realistic look at what's happened throughout American history when we've had dangerous, even criminal presidents. This is a book that argues that the traditional checks on presidential power, impeachment, and the Supreme Court really don't work. The thing that saved democracy when presidents, past presidents, and I profile 5, have threatened democratic values like the right to dissent or equal protection or the rule of law has been citizens, not public officials, who prevail on using elections and other techniques to put democracy back in order.
I wanted to ask you who posed the biggest threat of those 5. We've got Adams, Buchanan, Johnson, Wilson, Nixon. Who posed the biggest threat to democracy and why?
Well, I think I'll start with Adams, and I think you could make a case for any of them, but Adams in particular I'll start with. What Adams tried to do, just to be clear for listeners who haven't read the book yet, he had signed a Sedition Act, which made it a crime, just to show how partisan this was, a crime to criticize the President of the United States, but didn't make it a crime to criticize the vice president. The vice president, as many of your historically minded listeners will know, was a member of a different party, Thomas Jefferson. This was a partisan piece of legislation that was used to go after his political opponents, including newspaper editors, one of whom uncovered a plot that his party was involved in to try to really steal the election of 1800. Now, if that idea would have won out, either his plot to steal the election or the Sedition Act would have remained on the books, we wouldn't have even had an opposition party, and we wouldn't have had a right to dissent. And a right to dissent is fundamental. Without it, you can't even have the beginnings of a democracy.
Yeah, I was trying to imagine how many journalists would be in prison if criticizing the president was a crime. How did that get addressed? Because clearly that is not the norm today. How do we recover from that?
The theme of the book, of course, is about how in these instances, even though democracy was under threat, we did recover, and so that's the hopeful part of the book, as much as it's a warning about the perils of American democracy.
And was it Jefferson right away? Because I often quote Jefferson about I'd rather have newspapers.
Yes, in my story, it's partly Jefferson, but it's at the behest of newspaper editors themselves. What I say is that you might think, first of all, why did the Supreme Court not stop this? That's the sort of common sense idea that there's a First Amendment. It had been passed. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. But it turns out that the most influential Supreme Court justice of the time, Samuel Chase, not only lobbied for the Sedition Act, but went and sat on the trial of one of the editors to make sure he couldn't even raise the question of free speech, despite his best efforts to do so. So it wasn't going to be the courts. Instead, the story that I tell, and this is going to repeat throughout American history, is that it was a dynamic of citizens, in this case journalists, not public officials, reclaiming the right. In this case, editors used their own trials and their own shutdown and conviction of free speech to try to put Adams on trial and to make the election of 1800 a referendum on the right to dissent, on democracy, and on the idea that it's sovereignty of the people, not sovereignty of a president in favor of stability. So when Jefferson's elected, it's really because of the editor's efforts. And when he says, I'll give you another quote in his inaugural, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, he's really saying, I'm not going to shut down the opposition. And in that instance, he pardons all of the editors. He makes sure the Sedition Act does expire, it doesn't come back. And in that speech, he's really vindicating this idea of a right to dissent.
So I think a lot of people assume American democracy is rock solid. But in your book, you write that a closer look at the early republic reveals a different, sobering truth. We are and have always been one wrong turn away from a starkly different future. Why is that?
I really think Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero, we know him from the phrase, give me liberty or give me death. But when we listen to what he said in warning us, America, against ratifying the Constitution, we see the danger. He said, look, the framers have envisioned a virtuous person in the office. But what if you have not a virtuous person, but a bad person, or as he puts it, a criminal president? The formal checks on power are not going to work. Impeachment is not going to work. The court, he rightly predicts, is not going to enforce the Constitution. So he says what a criminal president will do is realize there are no checks and will collapse democracy.
Yeah, speaking of the judiciary, your book came out in July, one day after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the election interference case against Trump, giving presidents broad immunity for their official acts. Does that increase the potential peril of what Trump would do if he wins another term?
Absolutely. It really creates the danger that Henry is talking about and makes it so explicit. I mean, it is his warning come to life. Because if you think about the idea that impeachment hasn't worked in the cases that it should have worked, including in the January 6th case where there was a failure to impeach and disqualify Trump from running again, the check that remains is supposed to be that after office, a criminal president could be indicted. That's why Ford needed the pardon to pardon Nixon, because, of course, he could be indicted after. And now the court has just upped that idea. There is no text of the Constitution that gives this immunity. It takes Nixon's crude statement that when a president does it, it's not illegal, and blows it up. And when you see the extent of Nixon's crimes and, of course, Trump's crimes, we see Henry's warning again that this isn't just a problem of somebody getting away with a crime, any ordinary citizen. It's somebody who might have access to the most powerful office in the world getting away with a crime. And that's a danger not just to the rule of law, but to the idea of democracy itself.
Yeah, you talk about presidents threatening democracy and then recovery presidents. What do you mean by recovery president?
After moments of crisis, and I profile 5 moments of crisis, Adams, Buchanan, Johnson, Wilson, and Nixon, those moments are moments of fragility, and it's not courts that bring us back. What brings us back are citizens prevailing on what I'm calling recovery presidents, by which I mean presidents who are listening to these constitutional constituencies and restoring democratic principles. So restoring, in the case of Jefferson and Madison, the right to dissent. In the case of Lincoln and Grant, restoring the idea of the preamble that it doesn't say we the white people, it says we the people, as Frederick Douglass often pointed out. And in the case of the recovery presidencies of Truman and Johnson, getting rid of the idea of American apartheid, of segregation nationalized by Woodrow Wilson, and putting back instead the idea that separate is inherently unequal.
Did we ever recover from Nixon in what he stood for?
It's a great question, and that's the end of the book. And that's why I want to say we're in the crisis of the Nixon presidency right now. We never have recovered. So I interviewed for the book 3 figures who were still alive at the time who played central roles. One was Daniel Ellsberg. I interviewed him a few weeks before his death.
Oh, that had to be interesting.
And it was a fascinating, amazing interview, actually. He's so pivotal to the story of Nixon because as much as Watergate is what gets the focus, what it really was about was the shutdown of what Nixon thought an opposition in a civil war. And the leader of that opposition in his paranoid mind was Daniel Ellsberg. He thought that Ellsberg, for instance, had materials about his dealings with the Viet Cong, secret dealings before being elected, in a safe at the Brookings Institution. Ellsberg told me in the interview he did have that information, but it was at his brother's house. But anyway,
at his brother's house.
Yeah. And what Nixon says on the tapes, which you can hear, So this isn't just secondhand. Henry Kissinger says to him, Mr. President, if what you're saying, if there is that information in the Brookings Institution, this is a think tank in Washington, D.C., if it's in that safe, we should get it through the legal process, go to court. And he says, and this is a quote, "No, Henry, I want it done on a thievery basis."
Wow.
So the President of the United States is on tape ordering crimes, and we know that a plot was developed to actually blow up the Brookings Institution, run in, take the safe, and then be able to crack it once it was out. This is wild stuff. And why don't we know about any of these crimes? It's because the members of the grand jury who really did try to indict Nixon, and in fact, many of them raised two hands, according to Elaine Edlund, a legal secretary who was on the grand jury. They voted to indict him, but the prosecutor working with them, Leon Jaworski, convinced them, no, don't do it. In fact, if you do it, if you indict this president, he might have a coup. He might surround the White House with military and prevent you from moving on. Do you want to be responsible for that? He said, the president might, and this is crucial, might have immunity. Not that he does have immunity, and so you'll run into a hurdle there. So a deal was essentially made with the grand jury, and the deal was hand over all the information to Congress. We'll go to court to get the remaining tapes, and once the president steps down, this was the most crucial part, then I'll allow you to indict him. I'll go along with it. So a lot of this happened. There was a vote, not of the full House, but of the House Judiciary Committee to vote up articles of impeachment. And when Nixon steps down, Vladimir Pregelj, the foreperson of the grand jury, comes back to the prosecutors, to Jaworski, and says, what gives? Okay, let's do it. We made a deal. Let's indict the President of the United States. What happens next is a little unclear, but I'll give you the basic outline of what we know happened. A decision is made by Jaworski and by Philip Lacovara to go to Al Haig, then the chief of staff to Ford, and to figure out what's going on with the pardon. Are they planning it? Because they want to not obviously have the indictment come after the pardon. Anyway, it looks like Jaworski tipped off Haig because the pardon happens almost very soon after that meeting. And that's why we Americans don't know anything about what I just said about the Brookings safe, about the attempt to kill Daniel Ellsberg on the Capitol steps. All of that was wiped away by the pardon, and so we never saw the criminality of a president. We never saw the danger of the office. And with the immunity case, it makes it even clearer that far from recovering from the idea that a president really is above the law, we still have that principle. My hopes are that President Harris would be that person.
Is Biden a recovery president from the first Trump term?
I would have hoped, in writing the book, I was looking for him to be a recovery president. But I think the reality is that members of both parties have really refused to take on the main issue of the Nixon presidency, and that's the idea of a president above the law. He could tomorrow reverse, for instance, the Department of Justice's longstanding policy since Nixon, affirmed during Clinton, that says sitting presidents can't be indicted by the Department of Justice. Yet he hasn't done that. He has recently called for an amendment to overturn the immunity case, but he only called for it to be overturned in regard to former presidents, not sitting presidents. So no, he really hasn't gone far enough, despite his many accomplishments, in pushing back against Nixon.
And I was struck by what you wrote in the book's last paragraph. You said the Constitution's not self-executing. It will not provide democratic rights and presidential accountability to the people on its own. Instead, we, the people, must continually demand that our president honor democracy and the promise of the preamble. So if our listeners agree, what can they do?
One thing is to start to think about how to recover from Nixon. And the idea that a president is above the law is not something that should be allowed to stand just because the Supreme Court said so. So I'm in favor of legislation, certainly, and this has been proposed in Congress, to reverse the immunity case, to make it so that a sitting president or a former president, as one of the bills in Congress suggests, is subject to indictment. The legislation is part of it. I'm also in favor of taking away, that system that allowed Leon Jaworski, who worked for the president after all, to within the Department of Justice, who his role there in stymieing the grand jury. One fix to that is to bring back a law that we had on the books that Bill Clinton allowed to expire, called the independent prosecutor law. Ken Starr, for instance, or Lawrence Welsh were independent prosecutors. And that would create an office of a prosecutor charged with looking into a president's crimes, crimes, possibly with the power, I think they should have the power to indict that president, as Ken Starr claimed he did, without being subject to firing by the president, to take, in other words, the investigatory and prosecution power outside the Department of Justice when it comes to a president. That would be a real fix and a real recovery from the crisis of Nixon finally.
And neither party likes the independent counsel idea anymore, right?
That's correct. That was an idea that was advanced by Carter. He signed that law. He embraced it. In fact, when his chief of staff was looked into by the first independent counsel, rather than stopping it, he said, okay, we're going to comply. Lawrence Welsh was an independent counsel during Iran-Contra. Reagan basically did comply with that investigation. Bill Clinton originally embraced the law, and then after Ken Starr miraculously turned against it. I wonder why, and he allowed it to expire. And what I say to those who bring up Ken Starr in opposition to my call to bring back the independent counsel law, they say, what about Ken Starr? He was so dangerous. He made it impossible for Clinton to govern. And my answer is, I'd rather have 10 Ken Starrs than one Donald Trump.
In July, the Globe's David Scharfenberg wrote a piece titled, "Donald Trump Wants to Destroy American Democracy. He Will Fail." And David argued that reports of the republic's potential demise are greatly exaggerated. What's your response to that?
I read that piece and I thought it was interesting, but I think it's wrong that, as Patrick Henry predicted, and as I'm showing throughout the book, that the faith in the institutions that are supposed to work, and it is how the Constitution is designed, there are supposed to be checks and balances, as every grade school kid learns and middle school kid learns, but they often don't work. So let's look at the checks that the framers imagine. The check of the judiciary is supposed to be the most fundamental. We have judicial review to stop a president who acts criminally. And yet I just told you the story of how that didn't happen. Or how a president who shut down dissent is supposed to be checked, and yet that didn't happen there either through the courts. Well, what about impeachment? That the framers really thought of as the final check. And impeachment turns out not to work either, that even in January 6th, which is about as paradigmatic an example of what the framers considered a high crime and misdemeanor, a true attempt at a self-coup, impeachment didn't work there. And disqualification, which is supposed to, a second vote after removal by the Senate, there was a vote to disqualify. It never even happened. So these formal checks that we've all been taught are there, and that's normal civics in America. I'm really trying to say something different than that, which is, if you look closely, they don't work. Now, it's not to say nothing works. What works are citizens pushing back and appointing recovery presidents. But if Trump comes back, it's different than the other cases. In those other cases, once those presidents were pushed aside, they disappear from public life. He's coming back. That is a unique kind of danger. And here's the danger even more. It is true that in the first term, although courts didn't stop the travel ban or stop him in all sorts of ways that they should have, he was stopped by bureaucrats, by those in power who refused to do his bidding. This time he understands how to get away with these crimes, with these assaults on democracy. He's figured it out. So I appreciate the idea that there's supposed to be these checks and balances, but at least I urge everyone, including your columnist, to read the book and to see that's exactly what I'm arguing against.
So you're saying Trump would be more of a threat in a second term
Yes.
because he's learned how to use the levers of power.
Exactly, and that's what makes him so dangerous.
And looking ahead past this election to future decades, how hopeful are you that our American form of democracy will survive?
I wrote the book as a book about hope, and I don't want to underplay the danger. That's part of what we've done, is talk about the danger that Patrick Henry pointed to of the presidency itself. But yet we have recovered in the past, and that's meant to provide inspiration for the future. I didn't lay out who the new constitutional heroes are going to be. In the book, the constitutional heroes are the editors who fought back against Adams and prevailed on Jefferson and Madison to recover the Constitution. Or Frederick Douglass, I say, is really the most important founder of American democracy, even though he lived in the 19th century well after the writing of the original Constitution. But he really recovers the idea of we the people, of a declaration truly committed to equality, and prevails on Lincoln, but really Ulysses Grant to put things back. And I tell the story of the heroes of the NAACP, including the unknown Sadie Alexander Alexander, the most important civil rights figure we should all know about but don't, and Daniel Ellsberg I mentioned. They're inspirations for what should come next. Now, who's going to lead the charge here? I don't give the names. I am leaving it up to the listeners to take that upon themselves to try to recover American democracy. And they should get hope from the fact that it's happened before. It's not guaranteed, though. That's why I keep saying that there is no constitutional police or the document isn't self-executing. It's not a magic pill. And in fact, many of what the framers thought would be the checks just don't work. So it is, in the end, up to, well, it's the first 3 words of the Constitution, we the people.
Professor Brettschneider, thank you for joining us today.
What a pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for reading the book.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week.